The first gunshot echoed through Juniper Springs on the day Josephine Sawyer buried her husband, as if the thunder in the sky wasn't dramatic enough punctuation for the occasion. She stood stoic at the graveside, her black mourning dress soaked through from the downpour, while the town preacher hurried through his verses. No one expected her to remain standing in the rain after the last shovelful of dirt covered Thomas Sawyer's pine box, but she did, until there wasn't a soul left to witness her grief. Josephine Jo, to those who knew her before she became the widow Sawyer, had been married for 8 years to a man who'd promised her the world, but delivered mostly disappointment and debt. Now, at 26, she was alone in a 2-room cabin on the edge of town with nothing but memories and a stack of unpaid bills that had been hidden in the bottom drawer of her husband's desk. Mrs. Sawyer, the banker, Mr. Wilkins, said 3 days after the funeral, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he reviewed the ledger before him. "I'm afraid your husband's debts exceed the value of your property. You have until the end of the month to vacate." Jo's hands trembled in her lap, but her voice remained steady. "That's less than 2 weeks. I'm sorry for your loss, madam, but business is business." By the time she walked back to her cabin, Jo's mind was racing with possibilities, none of them promising. She had no family to turn to, her parents having passed years ago. She could sew, but not well enough to make a living. She could cook, but the town already had a restaurant and bakery. What she had was a small plot of land that would soon no longer be hers, a handful of chickens, and a stubbornness that her mother always said would either be her salvation or her downfall. That evening, as Jo sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink, a rider approached. She recognized Isaac Randall. Immediately everyone in Juniper Springs knew the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy with the piercing blue eyes and the silver-handled Colt on his hip. He worked at the R ranch outside of town, and rumor had it he was as skilled with a rope as he was reluctant to settle down. "Evening, Mrs. Sawyer," Isaac said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep, carrying easily across the yard. "Thought I'd stop by and offer my condolences. Thomas was. Well, he was a fixture around these parts." Jo appreciated that Isaac didn't try to paint her husband as something he wasn't. Thomas had been a dreamer, a gambler, and ultimately a disappointment. "Thank you, Mr. Randall. Would you care for some coffee?" He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "That's mighty kind of you." Inside the small cabin, Jo busied herself with the coffee pot while Isaac removed his hat and settled his tall frame onto one of her kitchen chairs. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. "I heard about the bank," Isaac finally said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Word travels fast in small towns." Jo sat across from him, her own cup untouched. "Then you know I'll be homeless by month's end. You got any plans?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Plans? No, Mr. Randall, I don't have plans. What I have are problems." Isaac's eyes, bluer than any sky Jo had ever seen, studied her face. "You know, the R is looking for a cook. The pay ain't much, but it comes with room and board." Jo's pride rose up like a wall. "I don't need charity." "It ain't charity, Mrs. Sawyer. Old Pete's cooking is about to cause a rebellion among the hands. Last week he served something he called stew, but I swear it was moving on its own." A smile tugged at Jo's lips despite herself. "I didn't realize the situation was so dire." "Desperate times," Isaac said, his own mouth curving upward. "Besides, Mr. Reynolds is a fair boss. He wouldn't offer if he didn't need the help." Jo considered the offer. Working as a ranch cook wasn't what she had envisioned for herself, but then again, neither was widowhood at 26. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Isaac nodded, draining his cup and standing to leave. At the door, he turned back. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Sawyer, I think you'd do just fine at the R." After he left, Jo sat alone in her kitchen, thinking about the fork in her path. By morning, she knew what she had to do. The R ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of Wyoming territory. When Joe arrived with her meager belongings loaded in a borrowed wagon, she was struck by the vastness of it all. The main house, a sturdy two-story structure of stone and timber, stood sentinel over a collection of outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses. In the distance, cattle dotted the rolling grasslands like scattered chess pieces. Mrs. Reynolds, the ranch owner's wife, greeted Joe with unexpected warmth. "I'm so glad you've come," she said, showing Joe to her quarters, a small but clean room off the kitchen. The men were about to draw straws to see who'd have to shoot old Pete. Joe laughed, already feeling more at ease than she had in years. Mr. Randall painted quite the picture of the culinary crisis. "Isaac has always had a way with words when he chooses to use them, Mrs. Reynolds said with a knowing smile. "He doesn't speak much, but when he does, people listen." Life at the Triple R quickly fell into a rhythm. Joe rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hand's hearty fare of flapjacks, eggs, bacon, and biscuits that disappeared almost as quickly as she could serve it. The men were polite, if a bit rough around the edges, thanking her with shy nods and mumbled appreciation. Isaac was often among the last to come in for meals, having already been out checking fence lines or moving cattle since first light. He would nod to Joe, his eyes meeting hers briefly before taking his place at the long table. She found herself looking forward to those small moments more than she cared to admit. As spring warmed into summer, Joe's confidence grew. She took pride in her work, experimenting with recipes and taking satisfaction in the empty plates that returned to her kitchen. For the first time in her adult life, she was earning her own way, depending on no one but herself. One evening in July, as Joe was finishing the dishes from supper, Isaac appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Sawyer, I wonder if you might join me for a spell," he said, his hat in his hands. "There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Joe dried her hands and followed him outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Isaac led her to the corral where a beautiful chestnut mare stood watching them with intelligent eyes. "This here's Penny," Isaac said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's gentle as can be and smart too. I thought you might like to learn to ride her." Joe approached cautiously. "I've never ridden before," she admitted. "Everyone starts somewhere," Isaac said. "And a ranch this size is hard to appreciate fully from the kitchen window." Over the next few weeks, Isaac taught Joe to ride during the quiet hours of early evening. He was a patient teacher, never rushing her or making her feel foolish when she made mistakes. Under his guidance, Joe grew confident in the saddle, and soon they were taking longer rides, exploring the far reaches of the Triple R. It was during one of these rides, as they rested their horses by a clear running creek, that Joe began to see Isaac as more than just a cowboy who worked the ranch. He told her stories of his childhood in Texas, of his years driving cattle up from the southern plains, of the places he'd seen and the people he'd met. "Why'd you settle here?" Joe asked, watching as he skipped a stone across the water's surface. Isaac was quiet for a moment. "Guess I got tired of moving on," he finally said. "Wanted to put down roots somewhere worth staying." As summer faded into autumn, Joe found herself thinking of Isaac more and more. She caught herself listening for his footsteps, watching for him from the kitchen window, finding excuses to be where he might appear. It was a feeling both familiar and foreign, similar to what she'd felt for Thomas in the beginning, but somehow deeper, more substantial. But Joe kept these thoughts to herself. She was a widow still in mourning by society's standards, and Isaac had never given any indication that he saw her as anything more than the ranch cook he'd helped in a time of need. Then came the night of the autumn harvest dance in town. Mrs. Reynolds insisted that Joe attend, overriding her protests about having nothing suitable to wear by altering one of her own dresses, a lovely creation of deep blue that brought out the amber flecks in Joe's brown eyes. "You can't hide in this kitchen forever, Mrs. Reynolds said as she pinned Joe's hair. "Life's for living, dear, not just surviving." The town hall was transformed for the occasion, with lanterns hanging from the rafters and tables laden with food along the walls. Jo entered hesitantly, feeling conspicuous in her borrowed finery. She nodded to familiar faces, accepting condolences from those who hadn't seen her since the funeral, deflecting questions about her new life at the ranch. And then Isaac was there, looking different in his clean shirt and polished boots, his dark hair slicked back with water. He moved through the crowd toward her with purpose, ignoring the eligible young women who tracked his progress with disappointed eyes. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, stopping before her, "you look out of place," Jo suggested when he hesitated. "Beautiful," he finished, a slight flush coloring his tanned cheeks. "I was wondering if you might honor me with a dance." Jo's heart quickened. "I'm not sure if I should. People might talk." "Let them," Isaac said, offering his hand, "unless you'd rather not." Jo placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved to the music, she was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, of the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, of the way his eyes never left her face. "I've been wanting to ask you something," Isaac said as they turned, "but I've been waiting for the right time." Jo's breath caught. "Ask me what?" Before he could answer, the music ended and they were interrupted by Mr. Wilkins, the banker who had foreclosed on Jo's home. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise. I trust you're finding your accommodation at the R satisfactory." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Jo felt herself stiffen, but before she could respond, Isaac stepped slightly forward. "Mrs. Sawyer is an invaluable asset to the R," he said, his voice level but carrying an edge. "Something you might have considered before forcing her from her home with such haste." Wilkins's smile faltered. "Business decisions are rarely popular, Mr. Randall, but they are necessary." "As are manners," Isaac replied. "If you'll excuse us." He guided Jo away, his hand protective at the small of her back. Outside, the night air was cool against Jo's flushed skin. "I apologize for speaking on your behalf," Isaac said. "That wasn't my place." Jo shook her head. "No, I appreciated it. Wilkins always did make me feel small." "There's nothing small about you, Josephine Sawyer," Isaac said, using her full name for the first time. "You're one of the strongest people I know." They stood in silence for a moment, the music from inside creating a distant backdrop to the cricket song around them. "What was it you wanted to ask me?" Jo finally said. Isaac took a deep breath. "I was wondering if you might consider staying on at the R even after your year is up. Not just as the cook, but, well, in a more permanent capacity." Jo's heart raced. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Randall?" "I'm proposing that I care for you, Mrs. Sawyer, more than I should, perhaps, given that you're still in mourning. But life out here is uncertain, and I've learned not to waste time when something matters." "I'm broken, Isaac," Jo said softly, using his first name without thinking. "Thomas left me with nothing but debts and doubts. I'm not sure I have anything to offer anyone anymore." Isaac stepped closer, his eyes intent on hers. "Not to me," he said firmly. "To me, you're not broken at all. You're brave and kind and stronger than you know, and if you'd allow me the chance, I'd like to court you properly when you're ready." A tear slipped down Jo's cheek. "I think I'd like that," she whispered, "but I need time." Isaac nodded, reaching out to gently brush the tear away. "Time is something I'm happy to give you, Josephine. I'm not going anywhere." As they walked back into the dance, Jo felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Fragile but real, blooming in her chest like a wildflower after rain. The winter of 1879 was one of the harshest in Wyoming Territory's memory. Snow piled in drifts against the ranch buildings, and the men worked tirelessly to keep the cattle fed and watered. Jo's kitchen became the heart of the ranch, a warm haven where the hands could thaw frozen fingers and fill empty stomachs. Through it all, Isaac was true to his word. He courted Jo with patient determination, bringing her wildflowers preserved in a book when snow covered the ground, carving a small wooden box for her sewing notions, sitting with her by the fire in the evenings when his day's work was done, talking or simply enjoying comfortable silence. As winter slowly released its grip on the land, Jo found herself falling deeply in love with this quiet, steadfast man. It wasn't the dizzy infatuation she'd felt for Thomas. This was something more solid, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Tell me about your dreams," Isaac asked her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching spring's first stars appear. Jo considered the question. "I used to dream about having my own home, children perhaps, simple things. But after Thomas died and I lost everything, I stopped dreaming for a while. And now," Isaac prompted gently, "now I'm learning to dream again," Jo admitted, but cautiously. Isaac reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "There's nothing wrong with caution, but don't let fear keep you from happiness, Jo." It was the first time he'd called her by the familiar nickname, and something about hearing it in his deep voice made her feel both seen and cherished. As spring progressed, so did their relationship. The ranch hands noticed, of course exchanging knowing glances when Isaac lingered over breakfast, or when Jo's gaze followed him across the yard, but they kept their observations to themselves, at least in Jo's hearing. Then came the day in May when a stranger rode into the Triple R. Jo was hanging laundry when she saw the dust rising on the road, resolving gradually into a rider on a lathered horse. Something about the way the man sat his saddle sent a chill through her, though she couldn't have said why. The stranger dismounted at the main house, speaking briefly with Mr. Reynolds before heading toward the bunkhouse. Jo watched, unease growing in her stomach as several of the hands gathered around him, their expressions growing serious as he spoke. Within minutes, Isaac was striding toward her, his face set in grim lines. "What is it?" Jo asked, abandoning the laundry basket. "Trouble," Isaac said simply. "The Blackwell gang has been spotted near Whitetail Creek. They've already hit 2 homesteads." Jo's hand flew to her mouth. The Blackwell gang was notorious throughout the territory, 5 brothers who robbed, rustled, and occasionally killed with impunity, always managing to stay one step ahead of the law. "Mr. Reynolds is organizing a posse to ride with the sheriff," Isaac continued. "I've volunteered." Fear clutched at Jo's heart. "Isaac, those men are killers." "Which is exactly why they need to be stopped," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't sit by while families are threatened." Jo wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but she knew it would be futile. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, principled, brave, unwilling to look away from injustice. "When do you leave?" she asked instead. "Within the hour. We need to move quickly if we're going to pick up their trail." Jo nodded, swallowing her fear. "Then you'll need provisions." "I'll pack something for you and the others." As she worked in the kitchen, preparing food that could be eaten in the saddle, Jo fought against the dread threatening to overwhelm her. She'd already lost one husband, though her grief for Thomas had been complicated by the discovery of his deceptions. The thought of losing Isaac, now that she'd finally opened her heart again, was almost unbearable. When the time came for the posse to depart, Jo stood in the yard with Mrs. Reynolds and the other women, watching as the men checked their weapons and tightened their saddle cinches. Isaac approached her last, his eyes soft as they met hers. "I'll be back before you know it," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Jo reached up, straightening his bandana with trembling fingers. "You'd better be, Isaac Randall. We have unfinished business, you and I." A slow smile spread across his face. "Is that so?" "Yes," Jo said firmly. "So don't you dare get yourself shot." Instead of answering, Isaac bent down and kissed her, their first kiss, witnessed by the entire ranch, but Jo was beyond caring. His lips were warm and certain against hers, promising return. "That's something to come back for," he said as they parted, touching the brim of his hat before swinging into the saddle. Jo watched until the dust cloud that followed the posse disappeared over the horizon, then returned to her kitchen, channeling her worry into work. 3 days passed with no word. Jo went about her duties mechanically, starting at every sound that might herald the posse's return. On the fourth morning, as she was kneading bread dough with more force than necessary, she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Wiping her hands on her apron, she rushed outside, hope and fear warring in her chest. But it wasn't the posse, it was a single rider, one of the hands who had gone with the sheriff. "Pete," she called as he dismounted stiffly. "What news?" The weathered cowboy removed his hat. "We found them, Mrs. Sawyer. There was a fight." Joe's knees threatened to buckle. "Isaac." "He's alive," Pete said quickly, seeing her face. "But he took a bullet. They've taken him to Doc Simmons in town. Mr. Reynolds sent me back to let you know and fetch the wagon." Mrs. Reynolds appeared beside Joe, her arm steady around her shoulders. "Go with Pete," she said firmly. "I'll manage here." The journey to town was the longest of Joe's life, though Pete pushed the horses as fast as he dared. When they finally pulled up outside the doctor's small house, Joe didn't wait for the wagon to fully stop before jumping down. Doc Simmons met her at the door, his spectacles perched on his forehead, sleeves rolled up to reveal arms spattered with dried blood. "He's asking for you," the doctor said without preamble. "Bullet went clean through his shoulder. He's lost blood, but he's strong. If infection doesn't set in, he should recover." Joe followed him to a back room where Isaac lay on a narrow bed, his skin pale against the white sheets, his left shoulder heavily bandaged. "Isaac," she whispered, rushing to his side. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face. "Joe," he said, his voice weak but clear. "You're a sight for sore eyes." Relief made her dizzy. "You promised to come back to me, and I always keep my promises," he said, wincing as he tried to shift position. "Though I admit this wasn't exactly how I planned my return." Joe laughed through the tears that had begun to fall. "As long as you return, I don't care how you do it." Over the next week, Joe rarely left Isaac's side, helping the doctor change bandages, coaxing Isaac to eat, reading to him when restlessness made him irritable. When fever set in on the third night, she bathed his forehead with cool water, praying as she had never prayed before. By the time Isaac was strong enough to return to the RRR, summer was in full bloom. Joe fussed over him despite his protests, making sure he didn't overexert himself as his strength gradually returned. One evening in August, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass, Isaac took Joe's hand. "I've been doing a lot of thinking while I was laid up," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "About what matters most in this life." Joe turned to face him. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That I don't want to waste another day without telling you exactly how I feel." Isaac shifted, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound. "I love you, Josephine Sawyer. I think I've loved you since that first day I saw you standing in the rain at Thomas's funeral, refusing to break even when everything was falling apart around you." Joe's heart swelled. "I love you too, Isaac. I think I was afraid to admit it, even to myself, but almost losing you made me realize how foolish that was." Isaac reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that gleamed in the fading light. "This was my mother's," he said, holding out a simple gold band. "It's not fancy, but it comes with a question. Will you marry me, Joe? Will you build a life with me, here at the RRR or wherever our path leads?" Joe looked at the ring, then at the man offering it, this steady, honorable cowboy who had seen her at her lowest and still thought she was worth loving. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." They were married on a crisp September day in 1880 with the entire ranch in attendance. Mr. Reynolds gave the bride away, and Mrs. Reynolds wept openly as Joe and Isaac exchanged vows in the small church in Juniper Springs. "I promise to cherish you all the days of my life," Isaac said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the church. "To see your strength, not your scars. To build with you something neither of us could create alone." "I promise to trust you with my heart," Joe replied, looking up into those blue eyes that had become her home. "To believe in our future even when the path is unclear. To remember always that what others might see as broken, you see as beautiful." Their life together began in a small cabin on the RRR property, a wedding gift from the Reynolds, who had come to think of Joe and Isaac as family. Joe continued to cook for the ranch, but now she returned each evening to her own home, where Isaac waited for her with an embrace and stories from his day. In the spring of 1881, they planted a garden to gather vegetables for the table, flowers for Joe's delight. Isaac built furniture for their growing household, and Joe sewed curtains for the windows, each domestic act a declaration of permanence, of belonging. When Joe discovered she was expecting their first child, she told Isaac on a moonlit ride across the land they both loved. His whoop of joy startled their horses and probably carried all the way to the main house. "Are you happy?" he asked later that night, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Joe answered truthfully. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming, if I'll wake up back in that two-room cabin with nothing but debts and regrets." Isaac gathered her close. "This is real, Joe. We're real, and we're just getting started." Elizabeth Randall was born on a snowy night in January 1882, with her father pacing the porch and half the ranch hands keeping him company despite the cold. She had Joe's brown eyes and Isaac's determined chin, and from her first breath, she was the center of her parents' world. As the years passed, the Randall family grew. Samuel joined his sister in 1884, and twins Rebecca and Robert completed the family in 1887. The small cabin expanded with each addition, Isaac adding rooms with his own hands, Joe making each space warm and welcoming. There were hard times, of course, droughts that threatened the ranch, winters that seemed endless. The year scarlet fever swept through the territory and claimed several children from neighboring farms. But through it all, Joe and Isaac faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each trial weathered, each joy shared. By 1890, Isaac had become foreman of the RRR, respected throughout the county for his fair dealings and steady leadership. Joe had opened a small bakery in town, operating it 2 days a week with the help of a now teenage Elizabeth, who had inherited her mother's talent in the kitchen. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Isaac surprised Joe with a gift, the deed to a parcel of land adjoining the RRR, purchased with savings he'd accumulated over the years. "Our own ranch," he told her as they stood on a rise overlooking the property. "Not as big as the RRR, but enough to build something of our own, to leave to our children someday." Joe, now 36 and more confident than the widow who had once believed herself broken beyond repair, looked out over their land with vision that extended far beyond the physical boundaries. "It's perfect," she said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "But you know I was already home." Isaac's arms tightened around her. "How's that?" Joe turned in his arms, reaching up to touch the lines that a decade of Wyoming sun and Wyoming winters had etched around his eyes, lines she loved because they told the story of their life together. "Home isn't a place," she said simply. "It's wherever we are together. It always has been, from the moment you told me I wasn't broken." Isaac smiled, the same smile that still made her heart quicken after all these years. "And you never were," he said, bending to kiss her under the vast Wyoming sky. "Not to me, never to me."